So yes, welcome to Learn Like a Boss, the neuroscience behind learning. I'm going to try to find my mouse and no, go to the next slide. There we go. So there's four main sections to this. The first one is about how memory works. Then we'll go into sort of what is learning and how neural networks work and how that affects learning. Then we'll go to change and how to actually start applying learnings. And finally, we'll go into learning state of mind. So the purpose of this is basically to give you some techniques for how to learn better, and these will be highlighted. But in order for this to make sense, I'm going to give you some background and the neuroscience behind that so that it actually resonates with you and you can understand how to use it. There are some caveats. Firstly, I'm not an expert in this by any stretch of the imagination. I'm just someone who has a keen interest in it. The vast majority of the content of this slide deck is backed by studies, and there's a lot of stuff in this presentation. So if you don't get it all, don't worry too much. I'll put the slide deck back up. It's just to give you guys a taste of it and sort of, I guess, to raise some questions that we can discuss later in the future. The other point is that my visual design skills aren't particularly good yet. In fact, when I first showed this to my local UXer, I think she threw up a bit in her mouth. And then after that, she gave me a couple of suggestions about how to make it better. And since then, I've actually had Dave McNamara go over it and fix it up. So it's actually a bit better now, or much better now. But so yeah. Cool, first section, how memory works. So the way that it works is you start off with a stimulus that goes into sensory memory, that you perceive it. Sensory memory is this ultra short, less than a second memory that happens below your conscious mind. And it's sort of a buffer for things that can go into short-term memory. Then it goes into short-term memory, which is about 10 to 15 seconds, and then long-term memory, which is up to a lifetime. So encoding is the process of turning things from perception into thought. So it transforms from a construct, from something that you perceived into a construct that you can actually store in your memory. There's multiple different types of encoding, one for each of the senses. So visual encoding, if you see something, visual, when you see something visually, you get iconic encoding. If you hear something, it's echoic encoding. And there's also semantic encoding, which is where you understand the concept of something. And this brings us to the first of the techniques, which is that when you're trying to learn something, you should try to utilize as many of your senses as possible. So for example, if you're reading something out of a book, trying to visualize it and come up with a visual representation for it is always a great thing to do. Or even when you're reading, to read some keywords out loud, and that taps into your auditory, into your echoic encoding as well. Another one is handwriting. Handwriting, it requires a different cognitive process than typing would, which also increases your learning. So short-term memory. So short-term memory has to do with what you're immediately and consciously processing in your mind. And it has the ability to both store things and process at the same time, sort of like RAM in your computer. It's located in your prefrontal cortex, but it has connections into all other areas of your brain, so you can pull long-term memory into your short-term memory. It's used to be considered to have the size of about 7. They used to say 7 plus or minus 2, but more recently they've actually revised it down to a size of about 4 chunks. And so, for example, if you were to look at the bird in the previous picture and try to really take in all the details, you might split it up into the 4 chunks of the body, one wing, the other wing, and the tail, and that would use up all 4 of your chunks in your short-term memory. And as an analogy, if you think about a whiteboard with a windscreen wiper that goes across every 15 seconds or so, that's sort of how it works. And based on that, you can actually keep things in your short-term memory through a process called mental rehearsal, which is where you repeat the thing over and over again. And basically, as the blade comes across, you repeat it again, and then you put it back there, and then you put it back there. And so that's what mental rehearsal is. A maintenance rehearsal, sorry. So long-term memory is where you store fundamental concepts and techniques which are involved in what you're learning about. And this is actually stored all over your brain. And the analogy is, for this one is more, it's like a highly fragmented hard disk where bits of memory are sort of chunked all over your brain. and it's actually reconstructed each time you recall it. So it's not like you just recall a bit and bring it into your brain, you actually reconstruct it on the fly. A key thing to remember here is that memory is the residue of thought, which means whatever aspect that your mind dwells on, that's what you're more likely to actually remember. So I've got a question for you guys. When reading something, which of the following is best for learning? 1 is rereading the section again. 2 is going over and highlighting key concepts of the section. 3 is just stopping and trying to recall as much as you can. And 4 is producing a concept map or mind map of the section. Who thinks the most effective way is number 1, rereading the section? No one? Who thinks number 2, highlighting? A couple of people. Number 3, recalling. 2 or 3 people. And number 4, concept map or mind map. So recalling is actually the best way of memory. So they did a study with these sorts of techniques, and they found that recalling was by far the most had the best way to actually remember things. So in terms of the first two, reading or highlighting, they're not effective because they don't really force you to think about it. We talked about memory being the residue of thought. If you're not actually thinking about the thing, you're not likely to remember it. And further to that, just reading things or highlighting them can lead you into illusions of competence, where you think that you know something when it's explained to you, but you can't, so like you follow along with a talk or read a book and you go, yeah, I get it. But then when someone tries to get you to explain it back to them, you can't because you don't actually understand it properly. Concept maps are really useful when you're trying to be creative or trying to link concepts together for things that you already understand really, really well. But not the most effective when you're trying to learn the basics of things. And that's why recall is actually the most effective. And an extension of that is sort of to test yourself. So either by resolving a problem from scratch or by explaining a concept that you've just learned to somebody else. So if you really want to learn something about a topic, teach it, hence why I'm doing this presentation. There's another technique which is named after a physicist, Richard Feynman. And he was a Nobel Prize winning physicist who was renowned for his ability to explain things very simply and clearly. And his technique was firstly just write a topic that you're learning on top of a page. Pretend you're teaching the concept to a new student and explain it really, really simply. If you get stuck, go back to your source materials and relearn it. And then simplify again and create analogies and metaphors. And the reasons why this is such a powerful thing is 1, handwriting, as we said before. 2, self-testing, you get to check that you've learned things. 3, you get to correct mistakes in understanding by rechecking them. This is essential with learning. You need to keep rechecking to make sure you're actually learning them properly. And 4, using analogies and metaphors, which we'll cover later. Consolidation. So consolidation is the process of creating long-term memories. It basically takes your current state in your short-term memory and then saves it into your long-term memory. Sort of like when your computer hibernates, it saves from RAM to its disk. And this occurs mostly during sleep. There is also a process of reconsolidation, which is where, so consolidation goes from your short-term to your long-term. If you retrieve something from your long term into your short term, it's called reactivation, and then reconsolidation is when you save it again into your long term memory. And this is, each time you do this, it strengthens the neural structures and helps you learn better. And again, each time you do this, you can result in altering your memories. So again, it's important to check things again to make sure you're understanding them properly. And this also occurs mostly during sleep. And so, because of the way these things worked, a technique of spaced repetition is very effective, where you repeat the concepts, say a vocabulary word that you're trying to learn, or a problem-solving technique over a number of days and space it further and further. And this allows the reactivation and reconsolidation to help you solidify the knowledge. Sleep. So we've already covered the importance of sleep in terms of consolidation and reconsolidation, but it also has other effects on learning. So one thing is that being awake creates toxins in your brain. Just the process of being awake, there are toxins that form in your brain. And after being awake for a prolonged period of time, your cognitive abilities diminish. And I'm sure you've probably all experienced this before, when you're awake for too long and you just can't think straight. And this is because of the toxins that occur in your brain. When you're asleep, the size of your brain cells, your neurons, decrease, which allows fluids to wash past your neurons and actually wash away the toxins. So thereby like renewing you for the next day. Also during sleep is when unnecessary memories are cleared and important memories are rehearsed again. So again, this helps you solidify what you're learning. And there's another thing that you can do, which is if you try to go over something you're learning just before you go to sleep, it increases the likelihood that you will dream about it, and that also helps you learn. So I don't know if you remember the movie Memento, where Guy Pearce plays a character, Leonard, who cannot make long-term memories. I'll just show you a quick clip.
Okay, so what am I doing? Oh, I'm chasing this guy. No, he's chasing me.
What's most likely to happen to him is that he has had damage to his hippocampus. Oh, let's see if I can go to the next slide now. There we go. So new brain cells are created in the hippocampus through a process called neurogenesis. And this is what's needed to create, to learn new things and create new long-term memories. So if you have damage to your hippocampus like he had, you can't actually create new long-term memories. And the brain cells die if they are not used. So that's why after you learn something, it's important to practice it to actually keep those new brain cells that you've created alive. So if you think about learning about this bird, it actually goes by these new brain cells that are created in the hippocampus, and then only after that can you store it in the other areas of your brain. And so the best ways to encourage neurogenesis and to help the neurons survive is exercise. Other ways are sex and less stress, and also diet, iodine as well. Easy. The exercise part, right? And the good diet, okay. So memory is associative, meaning that a new piece of information is remembered better if it can be associated with another piece of memory that's been firmly anchored into your brain. So if you have a look at the picture, this poor soul is trying to learn calculus again, and they've got some idea of how calculus works here, and they learn a new piece there, and it's associated based on the other part that they've already learned. So the more personally meaningful the association, the better the encoding and the consolidation. And so from here you get the concept where factual knowledge precedes skill. So you need to learn the basics of the topic that you're learning before you can actually become a master in it. And it also explains why it's easier for experts to learn something new than novices. So I usually go for a couple of examples. One is martial arts. I did martial arts for a while. And if you took someone who is an expert compared to someone who is a newbie, and they were both learning a technique that was new to them, the expert would almost always learn it much, much quicker because they've got all these other concepts that they've already learned that they can associate it with, whereas the new person doesn't have that. Also, let's say learning a new programming language, for someone who's already learnt 4 or 5 programming languages, learning one more is actually quite trivial for them, whereas for someone learning to code from scratch, it's actually a big leap to get to that first one. And again, it's because they've got the association there. Another one is around names, why it's always easier for you to remember names of your own culture, because you can associate it with other names and it sounds familiar, compared to ones that are from a different culture. And so based on this associative memory, there's a few techniques that come up. So one is if you want to use your semantic encoding by understanding the meaning of things, you use analogy and metaphor. So you explain the thing, you explain to yourself the concept in terms of some other analogy or metaphor, and that helps you do the association. And another one is say using mnemonics. I don't know if you guys have heard of Roy G. Biv, like red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, or learning planets, or all those sorts of things. They also help you do that. And then there's visual representation, and visual representation is incredibly powerful because of the importance of sight throughout our evolution. And hence we have the size of our visual cortex is huge as a result. And so to use this, do things like flashcards. You can do this sort of visual mnemonic, which is where you try to, if you're trying to learn a new Japanese character, the character ki, and you draw a picture of a ki and you associate it that way, right? And that's just a visual representation. And then there's ones where you can do visual and semantic. So this is a visual representation of, say, voltage, and that's also a semantic because it actually gives you a conceptual representation as well, as opposed to this, which is just like a little game that you use. I guess the key thing is that this sort of stuff may seem like a gimmick, but it's not. Doing this actually is a key mechanism to help you with your learning. And studies show that doing this sort of thing speeds up both the acquisition and bigger picture learning as well. So what is learning? So again, I'm going to give you some more techniques, but I want to give you just a bit of background. I'm going to go over this a bit quicker than last time because people said that this bit was a bit drawn out. So very quickly, a neuron is a brain cell, and neurons send messages through from one to the other via a gap between each neuron, which is called a synapse. And this sort of message here forms a neural network, and that neural network represents a thought, whether it be a memory, a concept, or a physical action. All of these things are controlled by neural networks. So if you think about an analogy, if your brain cells are little light bulbs and the sand is your brain, and if you have a bit of a river that comes through and touches various brain cells, they get lit up, they fire, and that represents a thought. And so if we talked a second ago about how the gaps between neurons, these synapses, and the key thing to learning is about potentiation, which is about strengthening synapses. So the stronger these synapses are, the more likely a thought will go, the easier it is, and the more likely a thought will go through that particular path, making it easier for you to do that thing. And so repeatedly firing those neurons makes them more inclined to fire together again the next time. And so if we see how that actually works, we have the transmitter here and the receiver here, and there's a chemical release that allows the signal to pass through. And as you practice it more and more, you get more and more transmitters and receivers, which allows the signal to pass through easier, and therefore more likely that you're going to be able to do that easier the next time. And so all the techniques that we've learned so far, recall, self-testing, spaced repetition, is about strengthening the neurons on a particular pathway.
Are there drugs that can make that process better?
Don't know. So to extend the analogy, potentiation or strengthening the synapses can be seen as sort of digging a trench, which allows the river that we saw before to be more likely to flow that way. And the stronger the synapses, the deeper the trench. So chunking. We mentioned before that your short-term memory can reach into your long-term memory to pull in thoughts from other areas of the brain, and then it can do its processing on that. But being able to only pull 4 things into your short-term memory can be a bit limiting, and this is where chunking comes in. And chunking is a mental leap that allows you to unite bits of information together through meaning. So a chunk is what happens when you get really good at firing a neural network together. It represents a skill. And through practice, you can keep increasing the size of a chunk or join chunks together to make them bigger. So if you see here, when we were looking at the parts of a bird, as you get better at recognizing that bird, instead of taking all 4 parts of your working memory, it just takes 1 instead. So if we think about a concrete example, if you think about children learning to read, or if you try to learn to read a new language with a new alphabet, at first it takes sort of all of your working capacity to just recognize the letter, to separate D from another one. Then as you get better, you can recognize that letter quite clearly. Then you start to try to push them together to make words, and then finally you can see the word quite clearly. And then by the end of it, once you've chunked it together, you can read whole sentences or paragraphs at a time. And this is how you've chunked together the act of reading into your head, and it uses less and less of your working capacity or working memory to achieve that. And so again, the analogy, chunking is like combining these trenches together to allow you to make a bigger trench. So if we extend the analogy even further, if you think about our working memory being taps with hoses that can reach into your longer memory, into your long-term memory and fire out neural networks there, chunking is joining these together. So instead of using 4 taps, you only use 1. Cool, steps to building a chunk. The first thing you need is focused attention. You want to use all the 4 of those hoses to focus on the one thing instead of having yourself drifting off and looking at other things. The next step is understanding. So it can be simple to synthesize the gist of something, which is sort of figure out the main idea or concepts. But understanding is sort of the glue that holds those traces, memory traces together. So you can build chunks without having proper understanding, but they're not going to be as useful to you because you won't actually know when to use them or how they fit together with other concepts. And there's a technique which is switching between the focus and the diffuse modes, which we'll cover in a minute, which really helps to build up that understanding. The next step is practice. So focused attention and understanding gets you part way, but there's a big difference between that aha moment when you first get something and when you fully understand it and know it well from practice. And that's where practice helps you entrench the concept into your head. And finally, it's about context, which is understanding when to use a concept and when not to. And so understanding how it fits into the bigger picture. So the first 3 are sort of this bottom-up way of building the chunk, and context is the top-down that allows you to think about where you can use it. So if you're reading a textbook or whatever, doing a quick skim through at the start to put into your head each of the key concepts and how they fit together and what it looks like is a way to help build that context. So a technique to help you with this is interleaving, where you jump back and forth between problems or situations that require different strategies. So, and this helps you select the chunk and when you will use it compared to where you won't. So if you think about when you were learning maths or whatever, you would learn a section about a particular topic, and then you go on to the next topic and learn a completely separate one. And then when you go to the exam, it wouldn't be quite so rigid, and you'd have no idea how to use it because you wouldn't know where it fit in. And so interleaving, going back and forwards, helps you solidify that knowledge because it creates this flexibility about how you're going to use what you've learned. So another part of helping with chunking and understanding is the concept of the diffuse mode. So to build a solid understanding and combine your networks together, neural networks together in new ways, requires a different type of thinking than just the focus mode, than just focusing on things. You need to sort of have a more relaxed style of thinking, which uses the diffused mode. And it's sort of like if you were to, it's associated with a neural resting state, like when you're walking or daydreaming or nearly asleep. And so when this happens, when you're in this mode, random connections occur between your brain. You don't need your short-term memory. Random connections will actually happen all over the place and help facilitate new ways of thinking. So it's useful for when you're trying to, when the problem you're trying to solve requires new ways of thinking, or even just concepts that you haven't thought about before, and joining them together in new ways. Exactly, right? And so, yeah, whether in the shower or bathroom break, or where you go away and come back with it the next day, this is when you stop focusing on it and you've allowed your brain to think about it better. And if you think of the analogy here, when you're if you need to get to this neuron here to solve a particular problem, but you're concentrating and really focused on it, and you've got like a lot of receivers, a lot of neurons here ready to receive. And in the diffuse mode, because you're a bit more relaxed, you don't have as much things in the way, and so you're more likely to get there. That's another aspect of it as well. So it's really important not to just like bang your head to keep focusing on it. You need to alternate between these two modes. So you can only be in one of these modes at any point in time. So you need to cycle back and forwards between them when you're trying to learn. So don't just focus all the time. Go back and forwards. Take a break. Yeah. And so it sort of brings the question of what did Thomas Edison and Salvador Dali have in common. You can see Dali pictured with his pet ocelot, Badoo. I don't know who has pet ocelots, just what you do. And so they both had a technique for stimulating new ways of thinking. And what Dali would do, he would sit back in a chair, holding his keys in his hand. And as he would drift off to sleep, the keys would hit the floor and wake him up again. And then at that point in time, he would grab all the diffuse thoughts that he had there together and sort of write it down, and that was how he would activate the diffuse mode. And Edison would do the same things with ball bearings in his hand as well. And then when they were doing this, they were entering a near sleep state known as hypnagogia, which is one of the ways of accessing the diffuse mode. And so yeah, alternate between the two modes when you're trying to learn something. Cool, change. So why is change important? So I did a course on Coursera a couple of years ago on which some of this content is based, which was called Learning How to Learn. And when I did it, I thought, this is fantastic. It's going to change the way I do things. I'm going to be so much better at learning. And then about a year later, I realized, oh yeah, I did that course, and I basically applied none of that course into my day-to-day life. And so I spent a bit of time, I redid the course, which is when I started doing this, and I spent a bit of time trying to understand what piece was missing, and it was all about changing behaviors. So there's like, learning a topic doesn't really make you an expert of a topic, it's just the start, it's sort of the practice that helps you get there. And so as a couple of examples, who knows someone who knows a lot about a topic, but isn't very good at it? So for example, coaches who have learned a lot about the theory but are actually not very good at coaching, or managers, for example, who know a lot about leadership theory but are actually very bad leaders themselves, right? I'm sure this will ring a bell. And so to me, there's no point learning this stuff if you can't actually put it into action. And this is what this section is about, how to actually put these things into action. So we understand it's really important to change, but there's a few obstacles to that change. The first one is that we are wired to fight against change. It hurts literally. So when you do change, it feels physically uncomfortable and painful. You get your pain receptors actually get lit up when you think about change and when you need to change, right? And there's a concept called homeostasis, which is the natural movement of any organism towards equilibrium and away from change. So we are hyper vigilant to detect change in our environment and try to get back to the familiar as soon as possible. So why are we wired this way? So historically, survival depends on being able to detect errors and respond quickly. So the error detection, if you detect the error, it triggers fear or anger and mobilizes you for fight or flight. And so we're tuned to see differences from the norm as threats. So if you think about it, when we're walking back from our cave and the bushes move, there's some anomaly, and fight or flight kicks in. And the reaction is either to create certainty again, either by running away back to the cave, or to examine the bushes to see what the problem is. And it's not symmetric. So we have an asymmetric threat and reward model. So we are wired to minimize threats and maximize rewards, but not equally. So there's a concept that we will walk towards something, but run away. And so we look at change as a potential threat more than a potential benefit. So, do you see these balls here? Catch. Nice. So when you catch a ball, it happens reflexively, mostly. So if you get good enough at something, it happens out of habit. And then when you get really good at it, you can perform it without thinking about it at all. And so when this occurs, the basal ganglia is what triggers the response and not the prefrontal cortex. So if you look here, it's like you get an extra hose that comes out of the basal ganglia that allows you to do something, and it frees up your prefrontal cortex to do other things. And so there are some motor habits that can actually be learned directly in the basal ganglia without needing the hippocampus as well. And so habits are great because they free up your mind for other things, but they can also be a bit of an issue for you as well. So we'll have a look at a habit in action. So for the following question, try to think of an answer in less than a second. So the first answer that comes to your head. A racket and a ball cost $1.10 in total. The racket costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Quick, first one that comes to your head. So who came up with the answer of 10 cents? So this is your basal ganglia jumping in to help you answer the question and save your prefrontal cortex for other things. Whereas your prefrontal cortex stops and thinks about it and comes up with the right answer, which is actually 5 cents. And so we have two different ways of thinking. One is the X system, or reflexive, and the other one is the C system, or reflective. So the X system is energy efficient, automatic and fast, which frees up your prefrontal cortex, your C system, to think about other things and process new information. It matches perceptions with patterns on the fly, and habits, rituals and routines are formed in the basal ganglia. And then there's your C system, which takes much more energy and is much slower. It processes information one step at a time, and it reflects on and challenges and corrects your C system. And so I guess the key thing here is that the brain can be lazy sometimes, and if we want to affect change, we need to work on it and engage the reflective brain. So we'll look at a particular habit, which is procrastination. So when you think about something that you don't want to do, let's say reading a boring book over there, the brain cells associated with pain light up. And if you continue to procrastinate, the unwanted task can become more and more painful. So to avoid that pain, you switch to another activity and you're rewarded with something more pleasant, say watching YouTube. And then dopamine is released into your brain and you now have a happy brain. And so the key thing is here that like any skill or habit, the more you procrastinate, the better you get at it. So if you want to break a habit, you need to actually practice other behaviors. So the key here is that once you actually start the task, the pain disappears very quickly. And so based on that, what you want to try to do is focus on the process and not the product. So for example, if you want to go to the gym and do exercise at the gym, instead of thinking about going to the gym and doing that exercise, you think about the simple things of just getting dressed, driving to the gym, and then say, oh, I'll just do what happens from there. Or if you need to write a really long thing, just say, I'll write 1,000 words. Another example of that is Pomodoro, which is Spanish for tomato, which is based on this sort of tomato timer here, which is you will set a timer for, say, 20 minutes. And then just do that task for 20 minutes. And usually the pain will go away, you'll do the task, you'll get into a flow, and then you can reward yourself after doing that for 20 minutes. So now we'll look at the anatomy of a habit. So first there is the cue, which is the trigger, the location, the time, how you feel, or your reactions. And the cue is neither good nor bad, but it's your reaction which is the key. Oops. Next, there is the routine, which is how you react to the cue, the actual habit itself. Then there's the reward, which is what you get out of doing the habit. So it's either the feeling of pleasure you get either directly from the habit or how you reward yourself for doing that habit. Then there's the belief, which is your belief in how you can or can't change the habit, or your rationalization around the habit. So we'll look at 3 habits and go through 3 habits as an example. So one is overslacking. So the cue will be the little message icon that pops up that says, you've got a message. Your routine is you spend a bit of time looking at Slack, and the reward is whatever random stuff you end up doing when you start looking at Slack. And then your belief or your rationalization is you saying to yourself, it's okay, I'm communicating. Then you've got eating junk. Your cue may be, I'm hungry. The routine would be the junk food that you decide to eat. Your reward is that, yes, it's yummy. And the belief is, well, I needed to eat something, it may as well have been that. Then there's nail biting, which would be, I'm nervous. The routine is biting the nails. The reward is you feel calmer. And the belief is, it's too ingrained to change. It's too ingrained for me to change now. And so if we go back to the analogy before, a habit can be like a really, really deep trench. And breaking a habit might require digging a new neural pathway for the stream to follow, or trying to avoid that neural net entirely. And so when you change a habit, you need to know that the willpower takes a lot of effort for your brain, and so you want to minimize your reliance on it. So you should rely on that only for the routine. So for example, don't surround yourself with crap food. And then, yeah. And you need to practice that new behavior. You need to practice it until you get better at it, until it becomes simple, until you dig that new neural trench. So to change the habits, you want to tackle it at each point of the habit. So in terms of cues, you want to try to remove the cues if you can. So silence your phone, disable notifications. For the routine itself, try to reduce the availability of the routine if you can. Right? So if your habit were junk food, then don't store junk food at your desk, store healthy food instead. Or delete YouTube from your phone so you can't do that habit. A really, really powerful one is to substitute another habit. And at this point is when you actually need to start using your willpower. When you're about, the cue comes and you're about to do your habit, you think, actually, no, I'm going to do something different instead. So, for example, like reading a book when instead of you looking at YouTube when you're bored, or instead of nail biting, doing a push-up, or whatever it is, you try to say, no, I'm not going to do that, I'm going to substitute it with something else. And again, focus on the process instead of the products. Reward is you need to, when you achieve not doing that habit or doing the new habit or whatever, you need to reward yourself. Take yourself out for a movie, whatever it is for successfully not doing that habit. And finally, belief is firstly, you need to believe in yourself that you can change that habit. And don't give up if you revert, because it takes a lot of time to build a new habit, and just reverting for a day is okay. You can go back and keep trying. Enlist the support of other people to help you. And also the motivation for changing also has a great effect as well, which we'll get to in a minute. So then there's creating new habits. So in order to teach your brain new habits, the routine needs to actually be made into a habit. And you need to repeat the same thing over again with the same context and the same cues. So one way to do this is to actually create a new cue. So you set an alarm that says, when the alarm goes off, I'm going to do this. You need to experiment with different ways of creating these behaviors. So, and what behavior you actually want to change to. So you need to actually try different things to see what works for you. And it's not easy. It's not easy. And there's a myth that it takes 21 days to create a new habit, and they did a study which shows that it's more like about 70 days, but it can be variable between like 20 and 200 or so odd days to create a new habit. So you actually need to keep trying it for a long time. And I'll go through a couple that I did. So the one thing, after learning this again and wanting to actually solidify this in my head, I've sort of created a little spreadsheet where I've got 4 or 5 of the techniques that I want to work on, and each day, at the end of the day, I check to try to make sure that I've done those techniques, and so I try to do those new techniques daily. That's one way to do it. Another one is nail biting. I used to sort of tear the cuticles around my finger quite a lot for 30, however many odd years. And I substituted where each time I felt the urge to do that, I would instead take a deep breath and breathe in, and that was enough. And it was hard at the start, and now I've nearly got over that habit. But it's very difficult to do this, and again, I used substitution there. But this is where it's all about. It's trying to create these new behaviours that are actually going to have effect on you. So substitution is really key. If you have a bad habit and you want to substitute with a better habit, that's a great way to introduce a new habit, because you've already got the cue there and you're ready to do it. So state of mind. So we've covered the importance of sleep and exercise in learning, but to be at peak learning and peak change, you need to consider your whole body, and that includes sort of the food you eat, your emotional state of mind, and also your motivation for learning.
Harry, help me get up! I got it!
So you saw he was pretty stressed there, right? And that's the link, stress. So when you have a stress response, epinephrine and norepinephrine are released, which increases the blood flow to large muscle groups and reduces blood flow to the extremities. like your brain, which is where you get the fight or flight reflex. And also cortisol, which acts as an anti-inflammatory, which decreases the immune system, and also stops neurogenesis. So remember, neurogenesis was what you needed to create new long-term memory. So when you are so stress prevents that. So it means that when you're stressed, you're quite literally perceptually impaired and cognitively impaired. So on that, there's motivation for learning affects your ability to learn. So there's two psychophysiological states. One is known as the positive emotional attractor, and one is the negative emotional attractor. And each of those states are a combination of your emotional state, so whether you're positive or negative or happy or sad, your hormonal state, and also a neural network. So it means that just being positive and happy doesn't necessarily take you into the positive emotional attractor state. There are some things that bring you into the negative emotional attractor. One is being evaluated by other people. Another one is the anticipation of being evaluated. So this is why if you're having those performance reviews which are in an evaluative mode, it's going to trigger the negative emotional attractor. Another one is focusing on your ought self, which is a vision of yourself inspired by what other people expect of you or what you impose on yourself about how you ought to be. And so when you get into this negative emotional attractor state, it actually triggers a stress response, and that stress response reduces your ability to learn. So your motivation has a big impact on how you learn. And so a key to bring you into the positive emotional attractor positive emotional attractor state is by focusing on your ideal self. So this is your ideal vision of yourself in the future. So if you're inspired to learn something or to change because you want to, as opposed to you feel you ought to be or someone else is telling you, you're much likely to actually change as a result. So some questions for you. Keep track of the number of times you answered yes. IQ measures your intellectual aptitude and predicts your intellectual potential. Your intelligence is something very basic about you that you can't change very much. You can learn new things, but you can't really change how intelligent you are. So if you're willing to, put up your hand if you answered yes to any of those questions. It's all right, feel free to, yep. It's okay, so if you answered yes, there may be some things blocking you from reaching your full potential. So Carol Dweck has done a lot of research into this, and she's come up with two different mindsets. One is fixed and one is growth. So the fixed mindset is where you believe your abilities are carved in stone, that you have a predetermined fixed potential that is unchangeable. So if you're in the fixed mindset, your intelligence is like your height. It's something that you can't change. There's the growth mindset where you believe you can change your abilities, that your true potential is unknown and unknowable. And if you're in the growth mindset, you sort of view it as your strength, which is something that if you work hard at it enough, you can get stronger. And so bear in mind that it's not necessarily black and white, it's a scale, and you can be anywhere on that scale. So what? Well, it can have a great impact on how you learn. So we'll have a look at the effects of the mindsets. So one, if you view challenges differently. If you have a fixed mindset, challenges are only a test to demonstrate ability because it's fixed. And as a result, fixed mindset people choose challenges that are easier for them so that they can excel. Failure means that you're not smart, which means you have an urge to prove yourself over and over again. Whereas for the growth mindset, you can't fail, all you can do is learn. Efforts. So for the fixed mindset, if you can't understand something immediately and you have to put effort in, it's because you weren't smart enough. So therefore effort is something that you should be avoided if you're in the fixed mindset. And I don't know if people remember when they were at school, or at least my school, there was a lot of people that would say, oh, I got 80% in this exam, but I didn't really study for it. Did anyone else hear that? So these are people in the fixed mindset here that if you had to study for it, it shows that you don't have the intelligence, and therefore you have to steer away from effort. And there's another point about effort, which is that if you don't put in effort, you can always say, oh, I could have done this if I had to put the effort in. And so if you put the effort in, it takes away that excuse, which is another reason not to put it in if you have that fixed mindset. In terms of feedback, brainwave studies show that people with a fixed mindset are interested in feedback which reflects on their ability, whereas growth mindset people pay attention to information which could stretch your knowledge. In terms of bad results, bad results for a fixed mindset reflects on them as a person. So they'll often say things like, I'm a reject, I'm a failure, an idiot, my life is pitiful, the world is out to get me, or if I got a bad result, I wouldn't bother trying the next time, don't let others measure me. Whereas for the growth mindset, they say, I'd try harder the next time, I'd study differently, I'd look at what I did wrong. For fixed mindset, feeling smart is when they were flawless and they were flawless straight away. When I don't make any mistakes, when I finished something fast and it's perfect, or when something was easy for me but other people don't get it. Whereas for growth mindset people, they feel smart when they had to work hard, when it's really hard and I really tried and I did something that I couldn't do before, or when I work on something for a long time and I figure it out. And the other one is cheating. People with a fixed mindset are more likely to cheat or more likely to lie about and inflate their abilities. And so as a result have an incorrect perception of their own abilities. And you may still be in the fixed mindset even if you don't show all of these traits. So for example, there are people who are willing to work really hard but not necessarily with the intent of understanding, but just so that they can sound intelligent or ace a test. So there are some people that aren't afraid of effort, but still have the need to prove themselves, right? So it's not black or white. And here's a nice little graph around that. So different views of challenges about avoiding versus embracing, obstacles, give up quickly, persist, effort, seen as fruitless or worse, seen as a path to mastery, criticism, ignore negative feedback, learn from criticism, and the success of others. The fixed mindset people feel threatened by the success of others, whereas growth mindset find lessons and inspiration from other people. So interestingly, the IQ test itself was designed to identify children who are not profiting from the Paris public school system, so that new educational programs could be designed to get them back on track. So it's not actually designed to measure your fixed intelligence or potential, it's designed to sort of measure where you're up to now and that you can progress further by the creator of that test. So it doesn't just apply to intelligence as well, it can apply to different abilities, and you can have a different mindset for each of those abilities. For instance, I can learn new things, but I can't really change how intelligent I am, so your fixed mindset of intelligence. Artistic ability. I'm not good at drawing yet, but the more I learn, the better I get. I'll never be any good at sports, or I'm a great leader, I don't really have to try, right? So you can have these different mindsets. It's not just about intelligence as well. So changing to growth. And I guess for some people this might have been a bit of not a shock, but I guess a bit of an epiphany that you have these sorts of traits. Maybe not. But the important thing here is that you can change, right? And when I first read the book about this, I was sort of thinking to myself, no, it's okay, I'm a growth mindset. Oh no, maybe I'm fixed. And I'm like, well, it doesn't matter, because the whole point of it is you can change to growth, and you can learn how to put yourself in a growth mindset. And so there's some really simple things you can do, and one thing you can do is just add the word yet at the end. I'm not good at drawing, I'm not good at drawing yet. That immediately starts you thinking of it's not about whether you're good or not, you can actually get there. Another one is to prepend how. So instead of can I do this, how can I do this? And then there's the ones that are a bit harder, which takes a bit more time, which is you need to sort of put yourself into the growth mindset. So you need to first spot the cues of when you're behaving in a fixed mindset and then put yourself in the growth mindset. So some examples of cues may be, oh, I can't understand this new thing that I'm learning because I'm not good at this. Or it's not me, it's because the explanation was bad. Or I don't want to fail, or I don't get it, I give up, or even, oh, this is hungry, this is hard, I'm hungry, I'm going to do something else. So spot those cues and then try to instead put yourself in the growth mindset. So what are the opportunities for learning and growth today for myself and for the people around me? It's okay, I'm here to learn and always improve. It's okay to fail, it's okay to try, and then sort of feel that tension leave your body and your mind opening up. And always believe that you can change your mindset. So append yet, prepend how, and practice the growth mindset. Cool. So the conclusion is that we sort of covered these 4 areas. We covered sort of how memory works, what is learning, change and how important that is, and how reflexes and habits work and how you need to change your habits. And finally, being in the state of mind for learning. And from there, we got a lot of techniques. Again, I'll put this up so you don't need to write them down. But there's a lot of different techniques there for how to learn and also how to change and get your mindset. And the bulk of this is sort of based on how to learn. A Coursera course there, Learning How to Learn. There's also a leadership course there. And there's also this book, Mindset, that I talked about. And there's a lot of other references there. Cool. Sweet. I actually do have a couple of minutes this time. On Monday at lunchtime again, I'll be doing a follow-up, which will be a bit more interactive. It'll be a bit more of a workshop where we'll dive into some of these topics. We won't necessarily have the time to go through all of them, but we can dive into these a bit further. Are there any questions, 1 or 2 questions now that came to mind?
You mentioned that if you say read before going to sleep, that it'll put you in a better position to start thinking going to sleep. Are there any other techniques like that that you use? Like, do you try to exploit that by learning something right before you get to bed, or?
Yeah, for me, yes. Sometimes I find that if I spend too much time learning before I go to bed, my mind is still wired and I have trouble getting to sleep, so it's a sort of double-edged sword. For me, the one that I try to... For me, one of the things that held me back quite a lot was I didn't like handwriting because it was very final, whereas with the computer you can always edit things, and I kept having that as my excuse. And what sort of flipped it was where I tried to focus on the point of writing things down is the process of learning rather than what I'm writing down. So I'll take my notes, whatever, and then I will go through a process of doing the Feynman technique that I mentioned, and I will go and I'll write down and I will draw pictures. And what sort of released me was that the pictures and the pictures I was drawing and what I was writing weren't a product. I wouldn't necessarily come back to them. The act of doing that was what was helping me learn, and that sort of freed me up quite a lot, because otherwise everything I had to do needed to be quite good and perfect, and I didn't like drawing as a result of that, and I would always use a computer. But just drawing them and focusing on the process of learning, that's sort of what freed me up and helped me learn a lot better. And so if you're interested, I can go through the notebook that I did when I was putting this together, and it was for me, it helped me learn quite a lot. Any other questions? All right, cool. I'll draw it to the end, and again on Monday, feel free to let me know if you're coming to the workshop. I've got cards up there. I'd love you guys to leave some feedback before you leave. Anything that I can do better, or things that you got out of it, or things that in the follow-up session you want to cover in more depth if it's not on that list. Cool. Thank you very much for coming.